Hi, you're watching Lost Submarine of World War I on the Time Team official YouTube channel with me, Tony Robinson. Submarines, mechanical leviathans patrolling the deep. These days, they're high-tech nuclear-powered monsters costing over £1 billion apiece, with the destructive force to level cities. Every major military power has its fleet, but the first working military sub was built here in Britain. The story of Britain's first subs begins just over a century ago, with inventors risking life and limb in a series of bizarre contraptions, launching an underwater arms race, which had a vital part to play in the First World War. Submarines would change the nature of warfare just as dramatically as the tank or the machine gun. They'd go from crackpot death traps to ruthless ship killers, and bring Britain to within weeks of losing the war with Germany. In this special programme, we'll tell this little-known story by exploring a series of wrecks lying deep in the English Channel. We'll be diving down to explore the remains of some of the very earliest naval submarines. And while we tease out their secrets, we'll test some cutting-edge Edwardian technology and conduct a few experiments of our own. This is a forgotten chapter of underwater history, the birth of a weapon that changed the world. Our story begins with the very latest thing in underwater technology. We're sailing towards an undisclosed destination somewhere off the island of Skye. It's mid-December, very cold day, incredibly murky, and we're heading for somewhere that most of us never get the chance to see. It's HMS Ambush, a nuclear-powered Astute-class submarine. She measures 97 metres from bow to stern and displaces 7,400 tonnes. It's quite extraordinary how sci-fi this all seems. We've come through this really choppy sea, and we get to the sub and it's just static and very, very black in the landscape, with the sailors actually being very formal, those black berets. It is quite sinister. Modern subs are ram-packed with technology, and HMS Ambush doesn't even have a conventional periscope. Instead, video periscopes give a 360-degree view of her surroundings, even in pitch darkness.
Okay, ready, XO?
Ready, sir.
Carry on, dive the submarine.
Carry on and dive the submarine, aye, sir.
The after casing's now underwater, and you can see the rudder there, and that'll slowly disappear under the water.
I can really feel that we're sloping now. Your feet have to grip a bit to stop you.
Yeah, I mean,
stepping
obviously
forward,
I'm sitting down, but yeah, you definitely can feel the sensation of.
Yeah.
In fact, we're now at 11 degrees down.
Yeah.
We won't go to much more than this, but you know, we're now driving under the water. You'll slowly feel the pitch coming off. You'll drive down to about 30 metres, and then you'll feel the pitch come on the other way.
HMS Ambush can purify its own air and water, and could circumnavigate the globe without surfacing. Its nuclear power plant will require no refuelling in the entire 25 years it's expected to be in service. And the vessel moves through the water in near total silence. Its sonar system can detect ships up to 3,000 nautical miles away. But all this spectacular technology didn't spring out of nowhere. The dream of underwater machines dates back centuries. By the 1800s, some submarine designs were edging closer to success. Inventors were building extraordinary new prototypes, Yet most of these remain downright dangerous. The Nordenfeldt pitched violently up and down with any change of weight. The Resurgam, steam-powered and slow, it sank while being towed. And the hand-cranked Hunley, the first sub ever to sink a ship, in 1864 during the American Civil War. But the blast from its primitive weapon also sank the sub itself, with the loss of all crew. It's thought she was still too close to her target when her armament detonated. These vessels all lacked a combination of three vital elements: reliable steering controls, decent engines, and effective weapons. But then, at the very start of the 20th century, a British-built machine would make an incredible breakthrough. This machine is currently languishing on the bottom of the English Channel. And to find the pioneering vessel, a crack team of maritime archaeologists are preparing to set sail from Eastbourne Harbour.
Oh, I don't know. This is just the best part of the day, it really is. And particularly on a glorious day, look, the sun's coming up, they're absolutely spot on. It makes me really, really envious that I'm not loading my own kit on there, it really does.
Time Team's Phil Harding's not just an archaeologist, he's also president of the Nautical Archaeological Society. But today's dive is too deep for him to attempt. So he's sailing out to the wreck with maritime archaeologists Mark Beattie-Edwards and Innes McCartney. As dawn breaks, the team head out for open water. The sub we're hunting sank while being towed back at the end of its working life, supposedly when the cable pulling it broke. And there it's remained for over a century. The few plans that survive are known to be inaccurate, so the team need to dive the wreck to see if it'll give up its secrets. Innes is Britain's top expert on the archaeology of submarines from World Wars I and II. He's dived hundreds of wreck sites around the country, exploring and cataloguing all the subs lost in British waters.
We're going to look at the wreck of the submarine Holland 5, which was the first submarine ever commissioned into the Royal Navy.
Hang on, you say the Holland 5 was the first submarine that was ever commissioned in the Royal Navy. What happened to 1, 2, 3 and 4?
Well, they were built and they were being reworked to reach a sort of point of perfection. And the Holland 5, being the last one, came off the production line in the way that the Navy wanted it, and so it was the first one they accepted.
The fact that she's part of that embryonic study of submarines makes her crucially important.
Hugely important.
Back in the early 1900s, to many in the Royal Navy, underwater vessels seemed an irrelevance. But some far-sighted admirals saw the sub's potential, realising that these machines might one day change the entire nature of war at sea. So the race was on to develop reliable submarine technology and prove its worth. The dive team are now approaching the wreck. At 6 miles out, this is Britain's furthest offshore protected wreck, and it's sitting at a depth of around 35 metres. There are only a few days a year when visibility is good enough to dive here. Even then, there's no guarantee it won't be churned up at the bottom. But we're in luck. The full length of the Holland 5 appears out of the gloom. What was once a gleaming high-tech machine is now teeming with marine life, from hermit crabs to cuttlefish. There's no time to waste, and Innes and Mark set to work. The sub's 63 feet long and had a top speed of 7 knots when submerged. she could safely descend to around 100 feet and had enough battery power to spend 3 hours travelling underwater. It was a state-of-the-art piece of technology. All the elements that sub-designers have since taken for granted first came together in the Holland subs. As Innes and Mark take their measurements, I'm going to explore another part of the Holland V's extraordinary story and reveal how this Royal Navy asset began life as an anti-British terrorist weapon.
If you want us to investigate more sites, you can make it happen. So, help us reach 10,000 members on Patreon.
We're diving a truly remarkable deep-sea wreck, the world's first fully functional naval submarine. This groundbreaking vessel pioneered underwater warfare. But incredibly, Britain's radical new weapon was designed by a committed Irish Republican, a submarine-obsessed engineer named John Holland, who left Ireland for the US in the 1880s.
When he goes out there and starts to actually seriously work on the concept, he is trying to work with the Irish Republican movement.
This is the Fenian Brotherhood?
That's right, yeah. The Fenian Brotherhood is like the US arm of the IRA, effectively. And he develops a working prototype, and he calls it the Fenian Ram, which is a tremendous name.
Yes, he's wearing his colours on his sleeve there, isn't he?
He is, absolutely. And it's to enable them to practice a form of what we'd call asymmetric warfare, basically.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they are a small insurgent organisation. They cannot build a fleet of battleships and defeat the Royal Navy in open water. But with a small, cheap, sneaky weapon, if you like, the maritime equivalent of an IED, they might be able to sink a ship and score a significant political victory.
And did the Fenian Brotherhood make one, and did it sink battleships?
They didn't. What they did do was fall out with John Holland in an unspecified dispute over money. They then stole the Fenian Ram. He got it back, but he never had anything to do with the Fenian Brotherhood again. The irony is that his business partner comes to the UK and negotiates a contract with Vickers to license build these things for the great enemy, for the Royal Navy.
And in 1901, the first of these experimental subs was launched. This early prototype has survived rather better than the later models. Believe it or not, this battered old hulk is the Holland I, which was lifted from the seabed 30 years ago in a daring mission led by the Admiralty. The wreck of the Holland I was raised in 1982. The vessel's now been thoroughly restored and is on display at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum. George Malcolmson, the museum archivist, is showing me round. George, this submarine seems almost comic to us nowadays, doesn't it? It's so lumbering and bulbous.
Well, it's actually quite an efficient shape. It's very efficient from a hydrodynamic point of view.
Presumably all the guts were taken out of it when she was lifted.
A lot of the interior fittings had gone deteriorated to the point where they couldn't be saved, so we've decided to leave it very much as it is now.
So there wouldn't have been a great void in the middle of it like there is now? It would have been a crowded and cramped interior, filled with spare torpedoes, compressed air tanks, and all manner of mechanical equipment. Not to mention the human beings needed to operate the sub. How many crew members were there?
There would have been normally 8 crew members, but they would have always carried 1 or 2 extra for training purposes.
Working in pretty difficult conditions.
Quite challenging. You had the engine exhaust fumes, petrol fumes, you had the gas from the batteries, very difficult conditions. You
say that there were 8 crew members, but in fact there were several more, very small ones, weren't there?
Yes, we had some extra crew members, some white mice were used almost similarly like a canary in a pit, where they were used to detect carbon monoxide.
Do you think the guys treated them like pets?
Yeah, often they were loved and overfed and looked after.
Well, they had their own rations.
They were on the ship's books, and naval stores supplied them with a ration.
The Holland 1 embarked on sea trials, but the Navy weren't fully satisfied with the design. So the next Hollands were gradually tweaked and improved. All records of these refinements have been lost, so to understand exactly what the modifications were, we're having to dive the last in the line, the Holland 5. Perhaps the most important of all the technological breakthroughs made on the Holland-class subs concerned stability. Early subs dived vertically by opening their ballast tanks. Air would flow out, water in. The extra weight in the tanks then caused the sub to sink. But as it submerged, the water in the tanks sloshed around, making it unstable. Holland designed innovative ballast tanks in which the water couldn't flow around freely, keeping the sub stable. He added a propeller system to drive the sub downwards on an angle. These breakthroughs meant that for the first time, a sub could make a safe, controlled dive. But there were still two other elements for Holland to crack: propulsion, the right engine to drive the propeller, and above all, a reliable weapon. This invention changed the world. It was built by a British engineer, Robert Whitehead, with a bit of help from his 12-year-old son. It's the very first effective self-propelled torpedo. And weapons like this made even the most modern, high-tech, armour-plated warships vulnerable. The best chances of sinking one of the new generation of armoured ships came from hitting them below the waterline, exactly what a torpedo was designed to do.
And a submarine is the perfect delivery system for the torpedo. You can get close to your target under cover, underwater, but you need to find a way of firing the torpedo underwater.
Only problem was, at the start of the 20th century, nobody had found a way to do this effectively. When subs fired, the change in weight caused them to pitch suddenly, and the torpedo would go off course. Down at the bottom of the English Channel, archaeologists Innes and Mark are trying to insert a camera into the Holland 5's torpedo tube. They need to take care, as a large conger eel is rumoured to have made its home here.
Mark, this is topside, come in.
Hello, topside, this is Mark. I am now at the torpedo tube opening.
Mark, was the conger home?
The conger eel hasn't come out yet.
Mark is struggling to insert the endoscopic camera. The tube is almost 18 feet long, and he's wondering whether the hatch at the far end may have been left open. If it had, this would explain why the Holland sank under tow. Water would have flooded in and capsized the sub.
More than 5.5 metres into the tube. Over.
Mark, topside, understood.
He can't easily see what he's filming, but on the video feed, we spot something lurking inside the tube. It's the conger eel. Mark decides to remove the camera and wait until the conger leaves. The design of the Holland's firing system was absolutely key to proving that the sub could be an effective war machine. Holland came up with an auxiliary ballast system, basically more air tanks that kept the sub from moving up and down with sudden weight changes. It meant that for the first time, a torpedo would fire straight and true. The video feed confirms that the hatch is closed, so it can't have caused the sinking of the vessel. Nonetheless, it's a big moment for the archaeologists. The first time anyone's seen inside the torpedo tube for 100 years. It's been a good dive, and Phil's keen to find out what we've learned.
Now, this is a very detailed drawing. I mean, it lists in great detail all the components. It lists also that it's boats 1 to 5. Surely that means that they were all the same, weren't they all the same?
What we've come to learn is that this is very much a theoretical representation, and there are a lot of very subtle differences between this and the Holland 1.
And I mean, what would this have come out of the need to change the design through the results of sea trials?
The Hollands were in service for several years, and they were extensively trialled. In fact, they were even used in battle exercises and actually sailed in anger on one occasion in 1905. So a great deal was learned about how how to operate these submarines, and it must also be remembered that there were no accidents with these. There were no fatalities and no accidents in service with the Holland, so they were successful, but their primary purpose was as a test bed on which to test the submarine technology and practice, and then move forward from there.
Thanks to the archaeologists' inspection and measurements, they've come away with a far more accurate picture of the Holland 5 than they could have got from the surviving unreliable plans. But they weren't able to see inside the sub. So Phil Harding has to pursue another line of inquiry. He wants to find out what Holland did to solve the problem of propulsion, moving a sub through the water. So he's travelling to the National Engine Collection just outside Manchester. Early engines were steam or gas powered. But imagine trying to fit this lumbering Victorian technology into a submarine. The biggest problem was the fuel. Coal was far too bulky to carry, and gas couldn't easily be compressed. So Phil's here to examine the engine that made a breakthrough possible.
I suppose it's not just a static engine. I suppose it does actually work.
It does run.
Let's see it.
All right.
You're going to start it with a blowtorch?
Yes, yeah, it's a hot bulb engine, this one.
And the radical difference with this engine was that it ran on a new type of fuel. The hot bulb sits inside the ignition chamber, and once it's hot enough, it'll ignite the fuel as soon as it comes into contact with it.
So when it's hot enough, I just flip this lever and it lets air into the cylinder to start it.
So what's so special about this engine?
Well, this actual engine is a paraffin engine, so we're talking a liquid fuel, and that's the big thing with either petrol or paraffin. You've suddenly got a liquid fuel source to use inside an engine, and then you can store that quite relatively easy in a tank.
But Holland also had to crack the problem of powering the sub underwater. An internal combustion engine like this needs air, and when a sub dives, air is in very short supply. So Holland incorporated another relatively new technology, a battery-powered electric motor. This would kick in as soon as the sub submerged. And crucially, the new liquid fuel engines produced enough spare power to recharge the batteries at the same time as propelling the sub on the surface. John Holland was the first engineer to effectively put this hybrid propulsion system together.
That was absolutely amazing. I'm just standing there looking at that thing. I was hypnotised. It really is just like a heartbeat.
They're often being referred to heartbeats, yeah.
And I guess, in a way, the engine was the heart of the submarine. It
yes,
really was.
It was, yeah.
At a stroke, this new system solved the problem of propulsion. Holland had very nearly arrived at a fully effective submarine. But there was one other bit of technology that he failed to include in his original plans, despite his design genius. There's one final bit of kit that was fitted into the Holland's design surprisingly late, although it's become the most iconic piece of a submarine's equipment, and it's this, the periscope. It was only put in on the insistence of Captain Reginald Bacon, who was the first inspecting captain of submarine ships. Now, you may think that something like this is absolutely vital. Certainly all later submarine designers thought so, because without a periscope, you can't locate, let alone hit your enemy, and you keep on bumping into things. And with World War I looming, the ability to find and hit your enemy was becoming rather important. With this last addition to Holland's design, the Royal Navy had a war-ready sub. But not everybody thought these early stealth weapons had any place in a civilised nation's arsenal. In 1903, Admiral Wilson wrote that submarines were underwater, underhand, and damned un-English. But whatever anyone might think of their morality, subs were now definitely here. They could be effectively controlled, they had workable engines, and in the torpedo, they had the perfect weapon. Underwater warfare was now inevitable. Whoever could build the best submarines would potentially win a huge advantage in the next major war. Britain may have been the first to complete a reliable naval sub, but now, with war looming, Germany was catching up fast.
So together we brought Time Team back, and now we're going to take Time Team to the next level. Help us achieve 10,000 ongoing members on Patreon.
The early 1900s saw a huge build-up of arms and armies across Europe. New technologies were springing up everywhere. Among them, the world's first effective war-ready submarines, the Royal Navy's Hollands. But after the first 5 experimental craft, no more Hollands were ever ordered. Almost as soon as the Holland subs had been completed, they were defunct. The technology was now developing incredibly quickly. It was an underwater arms race, with new innovations springing up every year. The Royal Navy immediately started building the next generation of submarines. But they weren't likely to have the new underwater battlefield all to themselves. Having watched the emergence of the Royal Navy's Hollands, the German Navy was also investing heavily in submarines. Phil Harding and Innes McCartney are travelling to Munich to take a look at Germany's attempt to catch up. Built in 1906, it's the U for Underwater Boat 1.
Wow, it's enormous. Wow. So presumably this is the main nerve centre of the submarine, the control room.
Right, this is where all the technical stuff is being controlled and where the orders were given to the rest of the boat. In here, you have at least 7 people, including the engineer officer and all the operating personnel.
And I mean, how about, just bodily functions? Where's the head?
Well, the head's on the submarine traditionally right up in the bows as they are on here. So the whole crew are using one loo. And so you can imagine what the conditions are like, particularly after meal times and everything else like that. We know that the officers were encouraged to take opium to make themselves constipated, essentially, so they didn't have to use the toilet and they could focus more on commanding the vessel.
So what you get the impression of is just how cramped this area must have been. People getting in one another's way, but they would have had to have been incredibly disciplined to work efficiently together. You only need one man to lose his nerve, and then the whole discipline of the vessel is going to be lost.
It's a fighting machine and everyone depends on the other one. But there was a common saying that when these boats were designed, the designers mostly focused on technical aspects and simply forgot about the crews. So once the boat was ready, designed in a technical way, they had the problem to put in the crews as well, and these were put into the spaces left over. This means the comfort was very, very low, even by then time standards.
So there really is a genuine thought, a realisation of the potential of underwater warfare and actually designing a boat to fit that pattern.
Most definitely.
German engineering skill meant they were soon catching up, building a fleet of 29 U-boats. Britain still had the numerical edge, 75 new D-class subs, the successors to the Hollands. But the German U-boats had one clear advantage. From the start, they prioritised range. These were vessels designed and built to go far out into the ocean to hunt down shipping. In 1914, they got their chance to prove their worth. World War I broke out. Britain immediately set up a blockade of Germany, an attempt to stop German merchant ships bringing in supplies. How did the Royal Navy operate this blockade?
Well, Britain is in a very good geographical position. The entrances to the North Sea and German ports were blocked here in the English Channel, and most importantly up here, the entrance to the North Sea.
So the Germans have got no other access to the Atlantic. If you put in a blockade here, then they're kind of stuck in the North Sea.
You've completely shut them out.
But the German High Command found that, somewhat to their surprise, their submarines were even more capable than they'd imagined. They were easily able to dive under the British blockade, slipping through the net and out into the Atlantic. Here, they could freely hunt down the masses of British shipping coming in or out of home ports. And in the first 10 weeks of the war, the U-boats sank 5 British cruisers.
First of all, they sank a cruiser called the Pathfinder, a small cruiser with very heavy loss of life. But then they sank 3 large armoured cruisers, the capital ships of the previous era, in the space of only a few minutes.
3 cruisers?
3 huge 12,000-ton cruisers.
In one engagement?
In one engagement. The reason it was so rapid was because each cruiser had stopped to pick up the survivors of the one that had been hit. That's the last thing you do. You make yourself a sitting duck.
This must have been a shockwave to the Royal Navy.
Enormous shock, yes. And suddenly an order comes out. If a ship you're in company with is torpedoed, do not stop to pick up survivors.
Did the German successes continue?
They didn't have to, because now everybody was very sensitive to the submarine threat, the underwater menace. Anything seen in the water, a broomstick, suddenly became a periscope.
So did this mean that already this early in the war, submarines had managed to force a change in strategy on the Royal Navy?
The entire British Grand Fleet, the linchpin of the British maritime strategy, is forced to move its base further away from the enemy, diminishing its chances of inflicting serious damage on the enemy fleet. And throughout the war, the underwater menace would prevent the British using their fleet as aggressively as before the war they thought they could.
But the British blockade was maintained. Small warships and minefields continued to prevent German ships bringing supplies through. Attempts were also made to stop the U-boats. Huge fishing nets dragged across the Straits of Dover. It might seem far-fetched, but this was long before the invention of sonar, and there was simply no other means of detecting a sub at the time. To find out how, Innes McCartney is going to dive a second wreck, a German sub captured in the Straits in 1915. It's the U-8, successor to the U-1 that we saw in Munich. The U-8's now lying 9 miles off the coast of Dover, and the team set out early to catch the best tide of the year. The wreck site is over 100 feet down, and Innes is keen to use the dive to find out exactly how this sub met its end. No blueprints of the U-8 survive, So the archaeologists need to inspect the sub to find out how far German technology had advanced by this stage in the war. At 9 o'clock, we're in position and ready to go. It's immediately obvious that the U-8 was a huge improvement on the U-1. It's far larger, so has greater range and endurance. It has 2 additional torpedo tubes, and its attack periscope is now an extendable tube, easier to use than the Holland's folding pole. This is definitely a sub that's ready for war.
Topside, we are at the conning tower. Over.
As Innes moves around the sub, he spots a pile of lead weights. They've fallen from the rear end and may have been used as ballast. It's a clue suggesting there may have been problems with the stability of the sub. Further evidence that the technology was far from fully evolved at this point in the war.
Topside, we are leaving the stern and heading towards the bow. Over.
Unusually, the sub has 3 periscopes, and to Innes, they seem much wider than the periscopes mounted on later U-boats. A large scope like this was easily spotted, and that seems to be exactly what happened. But whether the sub got caught in a net or was hit by some other anti-submarine device has always been unclear. However it was captured, the crew managed to safely evacuate before the sub sank beneath the waves. Innes is now honing in on signs of explosive damage that are visible on the side of the sub. He's concentrating on some large sections of damaged hull to try and work out exactly how the Navy started to tackle the U-boat threat. If he can record the precise blast pattern, the team can try to reproduce it in the lab and diagnose its source. But it's going to take detective work of an explosive nature.
Join a thriving worldwide community of Time Team fans on Patreon. Your ongoing membership enables us to develop more sites and more episodes.
Early morning, Salisbury Plain. Phil Harding's on his way to solve an underwater mystery. He's come to Cranfield University's Ordnance Testing Facility to blow up a submarine.
But we're miles from the sea. You haven't got a submarine, have you?
It'd be nice if we did. No, we're going to have to go to something a little bit smaller scale just to demonstrate.
So what have you got?
What we're going to use is this. This is my submarine.
Come on, that looks like nothing like a submarine.
It doesn't, that's true, but it does represent what we need to see in a submarine. It's cylindrical, metallic. The only difference between this and the sort of old submarine like U-8 is that this is a solid construction, a monocoque, whereas U-8 would have been riveted plate.
Crucial thing is that it will simulate what would have happened on the U-8.
Very much so, yes.
OK, we've got a submarine. Where's the sea?
Come this way.
Trevor fills a large blast-proof tank with water. We'll capture the explosion on a high-speed camera taking 4,000 images every second. When it's set, Trevor places the charge close to the canister but not in contact with it. We want to know how close an underwater explosion has to be to reproduce the damage pattern observed on the U-8.
Are we ready to go then, Trevor?
OK, we're all ready to find out. Phil, if I got everybody in undercover?
All right.
OK, when you're ready, Daniel. Do we have range clear?
Range clear, Trevor.
Roger, range clear. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, firing.
You could really hear a loud bang. Even for the small charge, it was a real bang.
Yeah, and that was only about a gram of explosive.
Incredible. It's like almost like a nuclear explosion. It's
Similar sort of thing.
It's a ball of white. There it is. Now, at that point, it's still not actually affected the submarine.
It's just hit it now.
Oh, what's all this white stuff round here?
That's the blast waves now hit it, and it's forcing the air out from inside the can.
Oh, yeah, and this thing, look, it is. It's literally pulsing in and out. It's like throbbing, like a heart almost. It really is. It's going in and out. And you've got all this air, which is being literally squeezed out of the submarine.
Exactly.
It just kind of seemed to blow the can apart.
The tests show that an underwater explosion can be some distance from a sub, yet still cause fatal damage. Back in the First World War, the Navy used this insight in their fight against the U-boats. They developed several anti-submarine weapons that could have created damage like that seen on the U-8. And after scouring the historical records, Innes now thinks he knows which type was actually deployed.
I think that's to do with the use of the explosive sweep. We've got a larger drawing, a modified sweep, as it was. This huge contraption. Well, these are all charges of TNT.
Absolutely.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's about 9 or 10 of them in a line, which is towed out behind the destroyer. They're anticipating where U-8 is going, and then when they think they've got the submarine in the right area, they detonate.
And you've got all these charges. Now, from what you can see on the damage on the U-8, is it likely to have been above the charges, actually within them, or below them?
I think it's probably below. I think the submarine is somewhere down here. The charges are set around about 30 metres apart, and we can see very clearly on the wreck, if I get this, the damage that we're looking at is actually on both sides. Just either side of the conning tower, there's areas where the outer skin has been completely removed.
I mean, see, this is exactly what I saw when we exploded that charge at our simulated submarine. That explosion, and then the water pressure. It was the water pressure that damaged the submarine, not the explosion. And I can quite envisage that would actually push in and cause exactly the sort of the damage that you're describing on U-8.
Inside the submarine, what the eyewitnesses who survived are saying is that water was pouring in from everywhere. It was coming in through the tubes, it's coming in through the conning tower, it's coming in through the sides, so that the shock has dislodged, moved, knocked things out of place and allowed the streams of water to come in lots of different places.
And then the only thing that the commander can do is to go up.
It was quite a lucky shot. I mean, we know, for instance, that the explosive sweeps, the one glory it ever had was the sinking of the U-8. So to actually now understand how that happened is something that I'm really pleased about.
But this was a rare success. Most U-boats slipped easily through the British blockade to wreak havoc on merchant shipping. And the U-boats were becoming ever more ruthless. They were now prepared to break international law and sink merchant ships without warning. It was known as unrestricted naval warfare. For the German Navy, the gloves were off.
They now had many more submarines. They'd been building them in large quantities. So this was, as they say in gambling, va banque. This was the final throw. And the final throw was to try to sink enough Allied ships, scare away enough neutral ships that the British economy would collapse.
How successful were they?
It makes the British Admiralty go to the Prime Minister and say, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, we're losing the war.
But that's extraordinary. The Germans are on the verge of winning the war because we're losing so many merchant ships because of the submarines.
Exactly right. One could say that the alliance of Britain and France and the United States might have lost the war in 1917.
In 1 month alone, April 1917, Britain lost over 860,000 tons of shipping, around 150 vessels. It forced the Royal Navy to trial a new tactic, the use of convoys. Under the convoy system, merchant ships would travel in groups escorted by destroyers. Merchant ship losses immediately plummeted, and Britain stood firm. And with the entry of the United States into the war, the tide really started to turn. The German High Command knew the game was up. U-boats had always been a big gamble, and it was one that very nearly paid off. But ultimately, it never quite cracked Britain. And eventually, in November 1918, the Germans surrendered. The submarine itself fared rather better. From then, right up to the present day, it's remained a linchpin of naval strategy. And despite all the later advances in technology, the fundamental principles and tactics thrashed out by the early pioneers haven't altered all that much. It's now over 100 years since the Hollands became the Royal Navy's first underwater vessels. But still today, submarines play a vital role in the country's defence. Although now, of course, they carry not just torpedoes, but cruise missiles, which can strike deep inland. So they're still the stealthy, silent killers that Holland originally dreamt of. Join Time Team on Patreon to access exclusive 3D models, masterclasses, and behind-the-scenes insights.